Okay, let's have a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, once again, we just thank you for this time together, and I pray that you'd be with us now as we look at the important topic of city evangelism and how that fits into the country living message. I want so much for each of us to have clarity in our thinking about this and how it fits so that we can move forward with a real certainty that we're working and we're traveling on your path in line with your counsel. Once again, I ask that you'd help me not to get in the way of things being clear for each one tonight. Please lead us and guide us, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. City evangelism and the country living message. I want to share with you two statements that are very interesting that on the surface appear to be in contradiction. I read an interesting article in one of our papers a few years ago suggesting the idea that actually God gave two lines of counsel, one to get out of the cities and one to stay in the city. What is that called? I mean, that sounds pretty confusing to me. So I guess what I get to pick? What's the point? What would be the point of having two different lines of counsel? And I read the article with interest, but I felt like it fell short. You know, it's interesting to me. I'm going to say this, but I think that education is valuable. So please don't misunderstand what I'm going to say here. I think if you commit your life to God, God can use that education in a great way. But sometimes it seems like someone who just embraces our message, someone just accepts our message, sometimes some of the things we say, suggesting ideas like this about the spirit of prophecy or canceling out some counsel here with something over there, I have often thought if I were brand new, I'd just turn around and walk the other way. I'd say, you got to be kidding me. What are you talking about? Sometimes, as I've talked with people about the country living message, and people say, well, but Mrs. White also said that we should stay in the city, right? I thought maybe the easiest way to solve the problem would be just give the counsel to an 8th grade class and ask them to tell us what it says. Right? Sometimes it seems like it takes a PhD to undo things that are plain and clear. And I'm not trying to say it's a bad thing to have a PhD, so don't take it that way. But anyway, so here is one of these statements. And I put the dates here for a reason, because of the timing, and they're well, anyway, I'll get to that. But notice what it says, Christian Service, page 180. We see the great need of missionary work to carry the truth not only to foreign countries, but to those who are near us. Close around us are cities and towns in which no efforts are made to save souls. Why should not families who know the present truth settle in these cities and villages to set up there the standard of Christ, working in humility, not in their own way, but in God's way, to bring the light before those who have no knowledge of it? Okay, pretty interesting, huh? Why should not families who know the present truth settle in these cities? And we're talking about the context of evangelism, and I've had people tell me that here's a quote from Mrs. White that says you're supposed to stay in the city. In this case, even move to the city. And no less families, with the implication would be with children. Now, that's not the only one. Here's another one. Testimonies for the Church, Volume 8, 244 and 245. Notice, by the way, the date, 1903. We've read a lot of statements about getting out of the city prior to that, but look what this says. It is not the purpose of God that his people should colonize or settle together in large communities. The disciples of Christ are his representatives upon the earth, and God designs that they shall be scattered all over the country. So God designs that his people shall be scattered all over the country in the towns, cities, and villages as lights amidst the darkness of the world. They are to be missionaries for God by their faith and works testifying to the near approach of the coming Savior. Well, this leads us to an obvious question. Is this a contradiction? Notice in the book Evangelism Now, this is a good place to go if we want to know about city evangelism, right? Go to a compilation of statements on evangelism. Said the messenger of God. Whoops. Let me go back. There we go. Said the messenger of God, shall not the cities be warned? Yes. Not by God's people living in them, but by their visiting them to warn them of what is coming upon the earth. Now, something I'd like you to notice about this quote is who's talking here? Who's in the quotation marks? Messenger of God. Presumably angel? Okay. So this isn't her talking. She's quoting a messenger who asks the question, shall not the cities be warned? Yes. Not by God's people living in them. Wait a minute, that's pretty clear, isn't it? How do we sort this out? Let's look at another one. As God's commandment-keeping people, we must leave the cities. As did Enoch, we must work in the cities, but not dwell in them. So again, a concept of evangelism. Yet we read a few moments ago where she said families should move into cities. How does this work? Here's another one. When iniquity abounds in a nation, there is always to be heard some voice giving warning and instruction, as the voice of Lot was heard in Sodom. Yet Lot could have preserved his family from many evils had he not made his home in this wicked, polluted city. All that Lot and his family did in Sodom could have been done by them, even if they had lived in a place some distance away from the city. Enoch walked with God, and yet he did not live in the midst of any city, polluted with every kind of violence and wickedness, as did Lot in Sodom. Evangelism, page 79. So, do we have a contradiction? Well, I mean, I know you know the answer to that has to be no, right? This goes back to what we talked about in our last presentation, where if we find a statement, or in this case we find two statements, that certainly seem to be out of harmony with everything else. I want to show you, this is so amazing to me. There is no contradiction at all. And sometimes, this goes back to that thing about sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees. Sometimes maybe we do need the 8th graders or the 5th graders or the 2nd graders to help us see something that even initially I missed in these statements that I think it's so interesting. All right, in Testimonies Volume 5, the quote that we really kind of took piece by piece in our last session. Notice this progression. Leave the large cities preparatory to leaving the smaller ones for retired homes and secluded places among the mountains. So what is the plan here as it's laid out? What was God's plan? Where were people supposed to go from the large cities? To small cities. So was God telling people to go to the city? To go to the small cities, to start working their way out. Now, actually, this is a very smart plan. Brilliant for me to say that because it's God's plan, right? So no bragging rights here, but why is it so brilliant? Because it's strategic. Because think about it. There was work happening in the large cities, right? And if everybody just up and moved and went right past, shot past the small cities and went right out to those secluded country homes, what's the likelihood of what's going to happen to the work that was happening in the big cities? So God's plan is step by step. Don't drop everything you're doing, but reposition yourself. Go out to a smaller outlying city where you can still keep the work going that you've started as you're making plans for how that work can continue, or maybe that work can be repositioned as well. But don't just stop the work cold. If you have interests, if there were evangelistic interests, can you imagine what a shame to just drop all that and run? God's plan was not drop and run. God's plan was step by step, systematic, from the large cities to the smaller cities. It's a plan that's sensible. Now, once you understand that, and here again we see it, we read some of these quotes before, so this is review. Get out of the large cities as fast as possible. That was the first step, from the large cities to the small cities. Again, out of the cities is my message at this time. Be assured that the call is for our people to locate miles away from the large cities. Now, let's go back and read those two statements that a minute ago, maybe it gave you that sort of like, what? How does that work? Now let's read them again. We see the great need of missionary work to carry the truth not only to foreign countries, but to those who are near us. Close around us are cities and towns in which no efforts are made to save souls. Now when you look at that, what do you see? Are these big cities or small cities? It's interesting that there's even additional language there to help us to see it in context. Her will was for God's people to, on their way out, for a time, it was appropriate for God's people to be in those smaller cities. So yes, it's almost as if she's saying, hey, as you're leaving those big cities, look for small cities, maybe where there's no presence, where there's a great need there to be done, and of course, knowing full well that also those people would be positioned to continue to do some work in the large cities nearby. Why should not families who know the present truth settle in these, what? Cities and... Oh, are you beginning to see a sense here where this is not a contradiction? And we're doing the same thing. We're taking what that mountain of counsel was. What sense would there be to say, and this is what some people have done, wow, well, I read those two quotes now, it says families move into cities. I'm just going to throw out all the other stuff about leaving the city. See, that doesn't make sense. So, why should not families who know the present truth settle in these cities and villages to set up there the standard of Christ, working in humility? All right, here's the other one. It is not the purpose of God that his people should colonize or settle together. The disciples of Christ are his representatives upon the earth, and God designs they shall be scattered all over the country in the towns, cities, and villages. Do you get the context? So it's perfectly harmonious for us to understand that, yes, small cities were appropriate. God was encouraging his people, look for small cities where you can serve. So you get the point, I think, the language there, towns, cities, and villages, cities and towns, cities and villages. The context is small cities. There is actually no contradiction at all. Now here's the thing that's concerned me, is that much of the talk that we've heard in recent years about reaching the cities and moving into the cities to reach them, this is not a new idea. It's an old idea, it's been tried before, and I call it the Lot plan of evangelism. That's what it is. It's not a new invention. You see, we've been given a game plan by God that's called outpost evangelism, to have places surrounding cities. And you know, the way I look at it is, there is just almost an insatiable appetite for outposts now. Look at these massive metropolitan areas, not just on the East Coast, on the West Coast too. What an opportunity for there to be many. You know, to me, this is the call, as I understand it, is for small home-like sanitariums, that the health work is carried out in a small home-like setting. And you can have many of these kinds of places around metropolitan areas. That's God's plan. Now, I want to make something clear, because I don't have any quotes up here, but if you search this, you'll find that it's true. There is an exception in the writings of Ellen White about the kind of places that we should still have in the city. And she specifically says that we should still have churches located in the cities, church buildings, to serve as memorials for God. So I think it's important to mention that. That's something that will help the outreach and the work. There's something else you'll find if you'll study into this, that there are times when she uses language such as in the city in reference to our sanitariums, and if you do the research, you'll see they were not. What she meant was they were within easy reach of a city, and she simply would describe it as being, in San Diego, for example, or whatever. What she was really saying is they're in that area, they're in that vicinity. So the Lot plan of evangelism, well, there's been a lot of talk about Lot tonight, so I don't think I need to hammer it a whole lot more, but I did want to read this. He, Lot, was saved at last as a brand plucked out of the fire, yet stripped of his possessions, bereaved of his wife and children, dwelling in caves like the wild beasts, covered with infamy in his old age, and he gave to the world not a race of righteous men, but two idolatrous nations at enmity with God, and warring upon his people until, their cup of iniquity being full, they were appointed to destruction. How terrible were the results that followed one unwise step. Amazing, isn't it? That's the Lot plan of evangelism. I know it's sobering, but it's true. Well, here's another statement about this. When Lot entered Sodom, he fully intended to keep himself free from iniquity and to command his household after him, but he signally failed. The corrupting influences about him had an effect upon his own faith, and his children's connection with the inhabitants of Sodom bound up his interest in a measure with theirs. The result is before us. Well, I've discovered one way to really encourage your friends to embrace the country living message. In fact, a pastor friend of mine who moved his family out of the city not too terribly long ago, he shared with me his most powerful sermon. You know what it was? That's your most powerful sermon. So it's come to the place where, I speak on it. Whenever I'm invited, I speak about it. I speak about it through media and on the web. But I try and not cross the line into harping and, hammering, because I know that actually the best testimony, the best message I can give is when I can post those pictures of us at home. When I can describe to people, one of the blessings, by the way, of a country lifestyle for us. See, I know we're living in a bad economy, but I'm assuming that you're aware that there's more than one economy. You're surrounded. It's almost like you might be blind to it, but there's another economy. We live in a different economy than most of the people in America. Because when you learn to grow your own food and you learn to live in a more, I'll call it a self-efficient kind of a way, you can enjoy the benefits of a whole different kind of economy. In fact, let me just touch on this. I touch on it in that first video online that you'll get, this is a little bonus tonight. This is very interesting to me that the country lifestyle brings within reach of anyone in any socioeconomic group, no matter how poor you are. You realize that the country lifestyle actually gives you the tool to tap into a strategy that is used by the ultra-wealthy in this world. And that strategy is this. The ultra-wealthy typically, okay, there's plenty of reasons why I'm not real interested in using the ultra-wealthy as a model. You can be ultra-wealthy and be a model person. Abraham, and he was, and Isaac, and so it's possible. But their values oftentimes are very different. But I just want to make this one point. Many of the most wealthy people in the world are actually not that focused on money. This is true. Money has inherent problems. And it's interesting to me that the masses focus so much on money. Look at it from just this one perspective. This is an inherent problem with money. Have you thought about this? Money is always losing value. Isn't that interesting? The dollar in your pocket is getting less valuable by the second. And then think about this. If you borrow money, how crazy is this? And I've done it, so I'm not trying to be hard on anybody, but think about it. So I borrow money. But what is true inherently about money around here these days? It's losing value. So I pay money for the privilege of using somebody else's money, which is using value, and I spent money and I'm paying every month, if I have a loan, money that's losing value. Do you see how this is a crazy cycle? The ultra-wealthy are more interested in investing in assets. More specifically, assets that they have a reasonable likelihood of believing will increase in value. Sometimes they mess up. But here's the thing. There's such a thing as country lifestyle assets, country living assets. For example, let's start with a country property. I mentioned already earlier today, one of the things that's amazing about a country lifestyle is, and we were told this in Inspiration, you can live like a king. It's what I call the millionaire lifestyle without being a millionaire. Generally, you can get far more land per dollar than you can in a metropolitan area. That's relatively obvious. the cost of living can be much, much less. You know, when you see that, I told you already, we're renting the property we're in now. And by the way, if you don't have the money to purchase, you should think about renting. I think I mentioned this before, maybe I didn't, but you know, I advise anyone, even if you have the money to buy, you should rent first. Because I've seen too many cases where people have lost thousands and thousands of dollars because they purchased prematurely. If they had rented first, they could have become more familiar with the area, the neighborhoods. There are country neighborhoods to some degree, you know, maybe 10, 20 acre parcels or bigger, but they're still neighborhoods. You have neighbors still. Not like you do on a city lot, but still, neighbors is an important issue. There's microclimates. There are places in the area where I live where they tend to get more snow, they get more difficult, the access is more difficult. There are other areas where it's better. Microclimates you learn about when you live in an area. Plus, when you're on the ground, when you're in an area, you tend to be able to find out about good deals more readily than if you're 1,000 or 2,000 miles away from an area. You can get to know people, you can get to know realtors, you can get to know neighbors, you can start word of mouth, building a network of friends. And people say, well, why would I want to rent? I'm just putting money in the pockets of a landlord. I can tell you more cases than not that I know of where if people had rented before they bought, they would have saved more money than they spent in rent. In our case, our rent is about $950 a month. We have 10 acres, a massive, massive shop, a 2,300 acre beautiful ranch-style home, a 2-car garage, and an apartment above that for an office, a pasture for horses, and a small horse barn, timber and meadow for $950 a month. I tend to think that's pretty good. By the way, we were looking at a piece of property to possibly purchase. When I tell you the price, you'll think this is crazy. No, I didn't have the money to purchase it. They wanted $950,000. I should tell you about this property. $950,000 for 160 acres with a 50-foot waterfall, some of the most incredible surface water I've ever seen. We watched that property. That was in 2008 and wanted $950,000. We watched that property go down to $865,000. I wrote the man who owned the property, was selling it. He said, I'm never going down from $865,000. It went down to $500,000. It went down to $350,000. A few months ago, it sold for $265,000. 160 acres with the most phenomenal. Now, it had problems. It wasn't, it didn't have everything right, which is one reason why we were holding back. It had an east slope, which can be difficult for growing. And that was a concern of mine. And it also had an access issue, which was kind of interesting. I won't go into all these details, but I'm telling you that story to make a point. Well, I spent $950 a month in rent. By the way, that trajectory that I just described to you, that downward trajectory in price, happened over the period of, well, from $865 it went down to $350 over 2 years. I was spending $950 a month in rent as I watched property values drop. Now, I don't suggest renting to try to speculate on the market, but in a dropping market, renting can put you ahead. In other words, by waiting, I could save more on that property than I spent in rent. Are you with me? Now, again, I reiterate, that's not why I do it. I don't do it to be speculating. I'm following my own advice right now by renting. We sold our place. We decided to rent before we purchased. That happens to be a side benefit in this market. And I could cite other cases too where property values have dropped more than the money we spent in rent. So easily it paid for itself. But I can tell you, I mean, there are a number of friends I know who moved to the country and they discovered that they didn't know enough about selecting the right country property. and now they want to sell, and they have problem properties. Now, you think it's hard to sell a city property? How would you like to be trying to sell a country property that has problems? And now they're stuck. They're wishing they rented first. So anyway, I wanted to tell you that because even if you, so that's the rationale why. Even if you have the money to buy, I would recommend that you rent first. And if you don't have the money to buy, I hope you see something. I mean, some of you rent now. Why can't you rent in the country? Okay, what's the big bugaboo? Job. Income. That's important. That's not something to take lightly. And in this whole idea of being strategic, I do not recommend that people move to the country without knowing how they're going to make a living. I think that needs to be solved first. And I addressed some of that in the video, the second video that's coming up in the series online. So if you jump into that video series, I do address that. And there are 5 ways that I see people addressing that. By the way, Mrs. White said we're supposed to address that. She said we're not supposed to be presumptuous when it comes to how to make a living. It is not, I've had people tell me, Dave, what, you just don't have enough faith. No. It is not an exhibit of faith to move presumptuously thinking that it's going to work out, that God's going to work a miracle for your income, because we're instructed not to do that. And I know of one case where it happened to work out. I could name you numerous cases where it was a nightmare for people. It was stressful. It was embarrassing. They became a burden on the local church. None of that needed to happen. I believe that God will affirm the direction you're supposed to move by providing an income solution. And you need to have that firmly in your mind that needs to be there first. I believe that the income question can drive your search. Some people are overwhelmed about the country living thing because they say, it's a big country. I mean, America's a big country. Where do I start? Unless you're independently wealthy, that's easy. Let the income issue drive that search. That's not the only issue that should drive that search, but that's one issue that should. Anyway, there's a lot more I could say about that, and I've veered a little bit off topic here because what I was talking about is God's plan for city evangelism. And that plan is for us to live out like Enoch, but work in. And when she was talking about Enoch working in, she wasn't talking about Enoch's job. She was talking about Enoch's ministry and his outreach. And I just have to believe that God knew what he was talking about when he gave us this plan. And I hope to see more and more along the lines of pursuing that plan in addressing how we're going to reach the people in these cities. Okay, there's one more thing I wanted to talk about in terms of God's strategy in this plan for evangelism, and here it is, captured very succinctly. I urge our people to make it their life work to seek for spirituality. Christ is at the door. This is why I say to our people, do not consider it a privation when you are called to leave the cities and move out into the country places. Here there await rich blessings for those who will grasp them. By beholding the scenes of nature, the works of the Creator, by studying God's handiwork, imperceptibly you will be changed into the same image. Selected Messages, Volume 2, page 536.